All right, guys, in the hot seat today, I have Spencer Lodge. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I've mentioned to you earlier. I've heard your podcast a lot. I know it's number one rated in the Middle East, and you've had tons of amazing guests on there. But I'd love to hear your backstory a little bit. Do you mind kind of starting anywhere you want to start? But I'd love to hear kind of the how you got to where you are now.
Yes, sure, no problem at all. So I'm from the UK originally, from just outside of London. I have grown up in a family where my parents were divorced when I was 7 years old and my father went bankrupt. And so I watched my mum bring up a family on her own, working three jobs, and was always impressed and inspired by this woman that did everything she could to provide for a family and then go on to be successful in business herself. And so that was an environment that I grew up in. I was kind of a lonely kid at school, didn't fit in much and was bullied quite a bit, and then left school with no qualifications and didn't go to university like many people do. And I got into the world of sales when I was young, and I was just very fortunate to be taught about sales by some very, very smart people, and they guided me and taught me really the A to Z of selling. And I found something I could master. I found something I was naturally good at, and I found something that I could excel at. And that was then the start of my journey, in the commercial world. And it started in office equipment with Rank Xerox and Canon and these types of companies, and then went into financial services in 1993, where I left England and went to live in Hong Kong and then Thailand and Malaysia and then Brazil and Slovakia and Egypt and Italy and Holland, and then to Dubai 19 years ago. So I've lived in many countries. I understand many cultures. I speak Portuguese because I lived in Brazil for the years I did. And I'm just a big, big fan of understanding that most people in the world are actually very similar, and find it quite interesting that people keep talking about what's different about everybody rather than what's the same.
That's a
And
really
so,
good. Yeah, that's a really good point. Sorry, who, when you were getting started, because here you are, relatively uneducated. I'm the same way. But who was kind of that North Star for you, or was there an early mentor for you that I think usually for guys like us that grew up maybe without a lot handed to us, there's somebody that stepped in. Was there somebody for you that kind of lit that fire?
yeah, there was a guy called David Schillingus and a guy called Eric Pomfret. They were my two kind of like sales managers when I first started selling. And David Schillingus every morning would train me from 6:30 till 8 o'clock in the office for 18 months. And I did exactly what he told me to do. And because I was young and malleable, I didn't push back, I didn't argue, and I applied everything he taught me. And it became very successful for me on the back of that. He's somebody that inspired me. He's somebody that made me laugh, demonstrated to me that he cared about my future. And funnily enough, many years later, after thinking, and I'm talking for 30 years later,
Oh, wow.
somebody in Dubai contacted me and said to me, I need a guy to help us with some sales training. I know you don't do it every day, but is that something you can help with? I'm like, where did you get my details from? He said, I've got a friend. His name's David Schillingus, and he really thinks you're good. And I got very emotional at that point, remembering the impact that man had on me. And so I sent him a message. I found him on LinkedIn, sent him a message saying, David, I'm not sure you remember me, but you trained me when I was a kid. You invested your time in me. And I just want to say thank you, because all of the success I've had is because of what you taught me. Um, I don't mind if you don't remember who I am, but hey, just thought I'd message you. And he sent this message back. Spence, how you doing, man? I've been following you for the last 30 years. He said to me, he said, I'm so proud of what you've achieved. I've been watching what you've been doing. Hell, man, I never thought you'd be that good. I thought you'd be good, but not
Yeah.
that good. So, hey, we'd love to catch up with you next time you're in London. And that was a very emotional message for me to receive, and one that I was in floods of tears that this man who had an impact on my life still remembered me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's interesting. I mean, I think to get a good or a great mentor like that, you've got to be ready to deliver, right? And I think from his point of view, and now you get to do this with lots of people, but I think when you have that young person who's coming up that's just hungry, that will actually listen, and it sounds like you just came in like a soldier and, hey, whatever you say, I'll do it, right? I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to do it. I'm probably going to do it maybe not necessarily better, but certainly from a work ethic standpoint, that I'm sure that's not what you fell up short on. Is that accurate?
Yeah, bang on the money.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And whenever I see somebody who's young, driven, passionate, and committed, I'm all over them. They just bring out all of the best memories I have, and I just want to do everything I can to fight for them.
totally. I feel the same way, and I try to, the young people that I'm working with, it's like just show up and deliver, and if you're around, I think the right leadership, the right mentors, that that's kind of, I don't want to say the game or the trade, but that is the trade off. It's like if a mentor is pouring into you, you go do the stuff they give you, and then you come back and they give you more, and that relationship just keeps going. And I think now you've been in leadership for 30 plus years, and I know I'm sure that your best memories now of being a leader is in developing, all the young Spencers that are now coming up.
I think that my role in life is to do a few different things. I don't think my role is to look for young leaders, but it's like peanut butter and jelly. It's kind of, I'm the peanut butter and they're the jelly. You can't keep us away from each other. You certainly can't keep me away from them, because I love fighting for the underdog. I love the underdog. I was the underdog, and to me, they're the best people. They've got something to aim for. They've got something to prove. They're running away from something, or they're running to something. And those types of people are that have the heart and the fire in the belly. I couldn't be more addicted to helping them want to win, because I just believe everybody should win. Everybody should win. I'm not one of these people that thinks if I've got competition that I should get it and you shouldn't. There's always plenty for everybody to go around. So I just want people to win.
No, I love that. So, what were you when you went into sales? You mentioned everybody's either running towards something or kind of from something. Were you trying to kind of escape that upbringing or that lifestyle that was kind of tough in your early years? What were you looking for when you first got into sales?
I wanted to be good at something, and I found I was able to do that. And I wanted to prove the bullies from school wrong. I was bullied by two people, Justin Zimmerman and Paul Fowler. I'll never forget their names. And I just wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to show them, as Tony Robbins famously says, the greatest revenge is massive success. And I think I took that to heart, and that's what I was aiming for, proving to them that they weren't better than me, or they weren't going to get me down. And whilst I might not have been able to beat them in a fight, I definitely could beat them in life.
Did you ever find those guys 30 years after on LinkedIn?
No, not 30 years. When I was in my early 20s, interestingly, I bought my first kind of fancy car. It was a Volkswagen Golf GTI. Then it was a special version of one of those. And so back when I was 21 in 1991, that was a thing, a hot hatch car. And I pulled up at a set of traffic lights, and there was a motorbike, a scooter next to me. And the guy shouted through his crash helmet, "Hey, Spence, Spence, Spence." And I'm looking at the guy in the crash helmet, and I don't realize who it is, but he lifts up his whole visor, and I realize it's Justin Zimmerman. And he's like, "Hey, Spence, how you doing? Oh, I love your car, man." And so it was really strange, because I wasn't expecting to see him. And so we pulled, after the traffic lights, we pulled over into a lay-by, and he just, "Oh, how you doing? Not since you've seen you since school. I hope you're keeping well." He said, "What do you do for a living now to have a car like that?" And I said, "Well, no, that car's not from my job. That car's from you." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, it was that incessant bullying that you gave me that made me wanted to prove to you that I could be somebody. And at 21 years old, the car you drive means you're somebody, doesn't it?" And so that was the sign of my success. And he had the scooter and I had the car, and it was like a little fuck you moment, to be honest with you. But I just thanked him for the inspiration.
It's so cool that you were able to. I know you had Tony Robbins on your podcast, and as I listened to you talk about that on another podcast, that you listened to his tapes like I did back in the 90s. I eventually became a trainer for him and worked some of the live events and things like that. But He talks about that exercise you may have heard of called if you're going to blame someone, you got to blame them effectively. So this guy, instead of just going, you ruined my life, you made high school a living hell, it's like, no, you were also motivation so that I did what I'm doing now. How did he respond to that?
I think he was a little bit dumbstruck. Again, you have to remember people's versions of events may differ. So
Right.
my truth and my reality may be a different view to him, and it certainly was. He didn't feel like he'd been treating me the way that I explained that he had. But it didn't matter to me. What I was feeling was what I was feeling, and even if I'd created some of that in my own mind and some of it wasn't true, boy, it was great fuel.
Yeah. Where did you take your early sales success? I know you've been all over the world, but like from a kind of timeline standpoint, what happens as you're making your way through your 20s and 30s?
So I'm in 23 years old, joined financial services. My first year in financial services, I'm selling financial advice, and I got really on a bit of a mission because I'd learned that if people don't have enough money for retirement, they're going to live for 25, 30 years poor, and I didn't like the idea of that. And if people really wanted their kids to go to a great university, they were going to have to get their money working for them to achieve that. And so I got kind of really zoned into that. And I went on a mission to try and stop people messing up their finances, their personal finances. And so I found it an industry that was really rewarding. And so I had some success in my early years, and 26 years old, I'd made $1 million, and I thought I was, super cool. And then by 28 years old, I had $1 million in my checking account. I remember that day very, very vividly. And so I was proving to myself that I could earn really good money whilst doing something really good for people as well. And that just carried on, that trajectory carried on until I became probably the most successful individual financial advisor in that industry, which was essentially what we would call back then offshore financial services. So financial advice for expatriates. And I then joined an organization, helped build that, left that one, and then set up an organization with a couple of other guys. And we grew that business and grew it around the world in different places. And I eventually exited in 2012 after building a company from, we started with about 20 or 30 of us to 1,700 people in 70 countries.
Wow. So quite the exit. What was that like? What was that transition like going from building this for a good chunk of your life to you've got the big cash gain, but now I'm sure I mean, were you already pivoting into something else, or was it kind of, you needed to kind of figure out where you're going to go from there because you're still a young guy?
No, I think I thrive on competition, but I was really good at what I did and nobody could compete. It was almost like I was just winning everything hands down. And as a competitive person, you need something to compete with. And I became a bit of a maverick, became a bit self-destructive, was a bit arrogant, a bit obnoxious, and started to make a rod for my own back, I think. And that was because the guidance around then, isn't what it is today. When I left the business, it was by mutual consent. I took a year off, of which I was paid that year not to work. And that was a very dark year for me. 2012 was really, really dark. And a few things happened along the way, took me into a spiral of depression. And so I wasn't happy at all. It wasn't until a few years later that I came out the other side of that. But I promised myself I wouldn't go back into financial services, but I did. Along with other companies in other businesses as well. But yeah, it was a dark period. But I was never an entrepreneur. I was an intrapreneur. I was making my income within a business rather than being the sole owner of a business. When I became an entrepreneur in 2016, 2013, I went into a whole new reinvigorated approach to life and business and stuff. And enjoyed it for a couple of years, but then I realized that it wasn't where my heart was. And so my business partner, Danielle, I asked her to take over the business and running of the business. And to credit to her, she has grown the company to much, much bigger heights than I would have ever been able to do on my own.
That time frame that you went through in 2012, it's interesting because literally at the exact same year, I had built up a big career in corporate America. Also developed some habits that weren't great, alcohol being one of them, getting progressively worse. And eventually that sort of concluded my big job where I had, at one point, 1,000 people under me, several $100 million P&L. And all of a sudden I'm on severance at home. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to get into recruiting, or, I'm trying to kind of figure out where I'm going to go. But it's kind of crazy when you've developed these other habits that aren't super healthy. And at the same time, that collides with, I guess, an identity crisis, because I all of a sudden went from, well, if I'm not this, then who am I? Right. And so it took, same with me. I mean, it took a few years. It's kind of funny. We mentioned we have Tony in common. I'd say up to that point, I had used self-development as almost like, if you're sick, here's the cure. So it'd be like, I need help with sales. Okay, Brian Tracy, Zig Ziglar, Tony, whatever. What am I going to listen to? And then I'd put it back away. Okay, problem solved, move on. If it was mindset, I'd listen to it, problem solved, moved on. And this had gone on throughout my whole adult life. But at that point, I was like, I'm in trouble here. Like life, things should be good. In your life, there was probably a huge payoff in that exit. You're being paid to sit at home. A lot of people on paper would say that looks great financially and from a freedom perspective. And yet, you were struggling and I was struggling. And I think it was at that point I went back and I went, I need to sink myself into this stuff and stay there, like really kind of be immersed and be in an environment where constant growth is, I guess, part of who I am, instead of something I occasionally participate in. But even with that, I got to tell you, Spence, like it wasn't overnight. I mean, I wish I was the guy that could go to one seminar and get it, because I think sometimes people are, but it took a while. And at the end of that, and it sounds like it was for you too, I want to hear more about it, but was a much more fulfilling life, was, where my why became much more about contribution and my family and other people versus my titles and how much money I was making. But it was a road. It was a journey, for sure.
Yeah, I wonder whether it's just us growing up or growing old, or being able to acknowledge the person we were before and not really liking that person. But again, you're right. Once you start focusing on others and what you can do to bring value to people's lives who are less fortunate than yourselves, I think that's when real meaning comes into life. And I think we all need meaning.
As you came out of that, what did become, or what, were you hit kind of in a lightning bolt moment, epiphany? Here's where I need to be spending time, or was it more gradual, kind of rediscovering, who you are and where you were going to go from there?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, it was being exposed to a group of girls from Bangladesh that had grown up in the slums, that had been brought to Dubai, and a friend of mine who had brought them to Dubai to help them get an education asked me if I wanted to meet them. I met them one day in a shopping mall, and from that moment onwards, everything changed. Those 12 kids became kids that I cared greatly about. Their pain and suffering was beyond compare, and my life of privilege that I'd taken for granted was something I then started to have to look at, because, as I say, my worst day ever is beyond the wildest dreams of their best ever day. And when that happens and you feel truly, truly moved, you then can turn that into something constructive. And people will say, you're so kind, you're so selfless. But let me tell you, spending time with those children and helping those children in every way that I could was actually an incredibly selfish act. I got so much more from helping them than I've ever got from anything else in my life. And I will always be grateful, always be grateful for the fact that I got the chance to be exposed to those girls, and they helped me deal with my clinical depression. They helped me deal with my purpose and my mission. And they are my one big injection of gratitude every week or two when I see them.
That's amazing. What about them? I mean, obviously where they were and where you were, and understanding that you could help them, but as your thoughts were forming around that and your emotions were forming around that, was it like, this is just what I need to do? Like, I need to help these girls and I need to help people. I mean, was it, but yeah, I mean, I guess, was it well defined? Was it like, oh God, the secret to this whole thing is contribution? I mean, what did that feel like, I guess, at that time, and what were your thoughts?
It was just an immense amount of gratitude that I had for being exposed to them. I didn't feel, I felt compelled to help, but I didn't feel like I was on some conscious mission.
Sure.
I just felt compelled to help and create that bond, and and that bond that was then created became the reason that I did what I did. They became the topic of my thoughts, the topic of my conversation, to know how they suffered. By at 12 years old, these children, when they have their first menstrual cycle, they're married to men that are 30 years old and raped and abused. And I couldn't get my head around how much suffering they had. And I just felt this urge to want to protect and in some way provide. And so they definitely weren't conscious. It definitely wasn't an epiphany. I think it was being interviewed, maybe the reason that I started to feel the way I felt, because I don't think I put it into words. I don't think I gave it a title. It was just me doing what I needed to do. And when people started to ask me about it, that's probably when I started to realize what was happening.
That makes sense. It sounds like they gave you purpose, right? Like whether you weren't defining it that way, but it was sort of like, you're waking up in the morning and going, I got to do something about this. Versus, it sounds like in the days and weeks and years that preceded that, it was, what's life all about? Why am I here? Should I even be here, right? And then it goes to like, no, I have to be here and I have to help someone. And even though that's not like you said, a well-deformed thought or a path, which would make it somewhat ingenuous anyway, right? I mean, I think the nature that it was just in your nature to help them probably helped you form a new identity at that point, subconsciously.
Yeah.
That's my diagnosis.
Subconsciously.
Sorry.
Hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. So
Thanks, Doc.
no problem. So where does it go from there?
Um, the podcast started to become a thing, and once the podcast became a thing, I'd interviewed a guy called Logothetis, who had a TV show called The Kindness Diaries, where he traveled around the world relying on the kindness of others because he believed most people were kind. At the end of that interview, I said, "You have a TV show, you're so lucky." He said, I said, "I wish I had a TV show." And he said, "Why haven't you got a TV show?" And I was like, "What?" He's like, "Well, why haven't you got one?" I was like, he said, "Would you like a TV show?" I was like, "I'd love one." He said, "Okay." He said, "I'll give you an hour of my time every Saturday morning for the next 6 weeks. In that hour, if you can make the hairs on my arm stand up, then you're going to come up with a good enough idea for us to make a TV show." And so for two weeks, we had these conversations. And in week 3, there was a director. Week 4, director of photography. Week 5, a producer and an executive producer came onto these calls as we got closer and closer and closer to wanting to tell the story of human trafficking and heroes, people that have been heroes and saved them. And so the girls were the center of the story for me, and the lady Maria Conceição, who saved them. Her as a hero was her story, plus 2 other ladies, Lena, who lived in Bulgaria, who was trafficked, and Hannah Badi in Nepal, who was also sold into prostitution at the age of 8 years old, who have gone on to do remarkable things. They became the centerpiece for the documentary that we made, which is almost finished now and about to be released. And we then had the opportunity to try and learn and teach people to understand what goes on in the world where they're turning a blind eye to, and what you can do. And it's not always about money. People say to me, "I'd love to spend some time with the girls." No, and they say, "I'd love to give some money to the girls. Well, how do I donate?" And I'm like, "We don't need your money. Of course we need your money, but we don't need your money. Your money's not the priority. The priority is your love. Can you give them some time? Can you give them some love? Because that's what they really need."
That's amazing. And so the podcast was birthed on the back of that. What year did you start it? I know you've got hundreds of episodes out and a huge audience, but what year did you start it?
2000, so 6 years old, the podcast, and the
Okay.
TV show came on the back of that particular guest, and that's how the journey started.
Amazing. And so the documentary's due out very soon.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the documentary's coming out. Where can we find it, and when should we expect it approximately?
We have one more voiceover piece to do, which should be, fingers crossed, next week or the week after. We then get to see the final cut. And once I get the final cut, then the show, we have a premiere of the show, the documentary here in Dubai, and then it will go on public release. I can't confirm whether it's Hulu, Netflix, or Apple or Disney or Amazon right this minute. But as soon as I know, everybody will be told through my social media channels.
Amazing. So talk to me a little bit about the podcast and how you got that started. And, you know, it's very difficult in podcasting, I think, to build the size of an audience that you've built. So can you walk me through a little bit, like how you got into it, why you got into it, and how it took off and became the number one listened to podcast in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to do it at first. I was asked for about a year to do the podcast by a friend of mine, Raj Katecha, and I just didn't want to do it. It was just I didn't see the benefit of it. So he persuaded me. I did a few episodes, wasn't convinced, but thought I've started it now, so I better crack on with it. And I think we got going. We had a few interesting guests, and I was starting to get interested in the people we had as guests, and then we had the opportunity to get Tony on the show. And Tony, I don't know, it was episode 30 or something, I can't remember, but he came on the show, and it essentially took this beginner, mediocre, nothing really podcast, and it enabled us to leverage Tony for the guests that we would love to have had, but we had no chance of getting. And from there, it started to become something that people consumed. It twisted and turned from personal development into real life stories, because I wanted to interview heroes, people that had been through unimaginable difficulties and came out the other side. We then leapt into trying to teach people crypto in simple language, and focused on that. And to me, for anybody to have a prospect, one of the greatest benefits of a podcast, one of the greatest benefits of podcast is you can prospect for your business on a podcast. And so it doesn't matter whether you're interviewing big names or who's actually watching. What matters is you're getting value out of it yourself. And I found that was really rewarding. And I've made every mistake that you can make. I've done everything wrong that you can do wrong. I haven't got a clue what I'm doing half the time. I've got, luckily, a great team around me that know what they're doing. And I fumble and bumble my way along into where it is now. And I feel like, you know, when I look at some others that have been more successful in a lesser period of time, it gets me down, but it drives me. And I just want to do the best job I can do. I'm not a master of social media. I'm not a master of content creation. I'm just generally interested in real people and real stories and real lives.
Yeah, I mean, just from my point of view, I mean, I think the reason it's so successful, of course, the guests you've had on have helped, but I think it's because the conversations are very real. The podcast is called Unscripted, and that's exactly, you know, what it is. I mean, when you get on there, you don't know what you're going to get. It's going to be meaningful. It's going to be honest. And I loved, the episodes that I've heard. I know there's a story around how you got, Tony on the show. Do you mind sharing that with us? Because everybody wants Tony Robbins on their podcast for many reasons, but the biggest one is that, like it did for you, it put your podcast on the map. So talk to me about that.
What were you told about it then, if you've heard a story?
Well, I know that so again, I work in that world sometimes as a volunteer. I know that he's got an army of marketing people around him, and there's kind of like 2 or 3 walls of penetration to even get Tony to look at something. And I know that you did something to break through that. And I just think it'd be cool for our audience to hear about that.
So my friend Omar and I decided we wanted to interview Tony, and it was like, how do we do it? And Omar had met somebody who worked on Tony's private jet. And he'd met somebody by chance somewhere in America. She was chatting. I forget what her name was. He came back. He's like, "We need to get Tony." I'm like, "Okay." I said, "Let's get hold of his marketing lady." And so we contacted her, and she was like, "No, no chance." We knew he was coming to Dubai, and it was like, right, what do we do? And my sponsor at the time was a company called Najahi, and Najahi were bringing Tony. And I'm like, "Guys, can we have Tony, please?" And Najahi reached out and said, "No chance." So then I contacted his publicist, didn't get a response, sent her a bouquet of flowers to say, "Can we please have a chat?" She ignored me. I then sent her a dozen donuts, and she called me straight back. She said, "I don't like flowers, but I like donuts. What do you want?" And I said, "Look, I want Tony on the podcast. I don't know what I need to do, but how do I go about doing it?" She said, "No, it's not going to happen." I'm like, "So I wasted the donuts." And I think she might have been sitting at a desk eating one of them at the time. And she was like, "All right, I tell you what, make a video. No, not a long one, a 1 minute video telling Tony why you think he should be on your podcast. And I will give the video. If I look at it and like it, I'll give it to his private stewardess on the plane, and I'll ask her to show him the video on her phone. And that's it. That's all I can do." I'm like, "That's all I could ever ask for. Thank you so much." So Omar and I made this video. "It's not about resources, it's about resourcefulness, Tony." And we went on the whole kind of like shoved all of Tony Robbins' great stuff back down his throat on this 1 minute video with bags of energy and humor. And it then got to him, and they played it, and Tony was like, "Who the hell are these guys?" And he agreed for some crazy reason. He agreed, and we knew when he was coming to the studio. He said, "Look," or his team said, "Look, you've got 30 minutes for an interview, no longer." That morning, we had what looked like the FBI come into the studio to check everything. You know, they had mirrors down the toilets. It was really weird, this security sweep they were doing. And then Tony turns up, and usually in the studio, there's 6 or 7 people. Here, there was more than 20 people this day because Tony Robbins was coming. He came in, he was gracious, he was graceful. We did the interview, expecting him to leave after 30 minutes, and 2.5 hours later, he's still sat there, but with everybody. He's done a video with every individual, a photo, a selfie, answered a business question, answered a personal question, answered a relationship question. And he just sat on the side of this stage and was just beautiful, just beautiful. And it was a very special moment for me because he was a hero of mine. And he was just really gracious. And then we had the event the next day or the day after that at the Coca-Cola Arena with 10,000 people. And I walked down to the front of the stage, and while he's mid-flow doing his thing, he walks over and he points at me and he's like, "My man," and grabs hold of me and gives me a hug, and then gets back up on stage. And what an awesome guy, he says as he points at me and walks off. And I was just like, oh, that was a little bit of a moment there as well.
Wow.
And I'd had my opportunity to spend time with Tony, but Omar played a big part in here from Mental Unblock. He's a great guy. And it was just trying to find a way and not accepting no, and knowing that you're going to be rejected. So don't get downhearted or downtrodden. Just keep pushing. You'll find a way. And I'm one of these people that's like, you don't start selling until someone says no. So what's the point? You might as well crack on anyway.
Sure. I mean, and Tony's so, not that I know him personally, but I know he appreciates the people. I mean, the wall is there for a reason. I mean, part of it for obvious reasons, security and things like that. The other part is, hey, I'm not going to talk to everybody. I mean, people have to make an effort, and so I know he really appreciates that when it's gone through. I've seen other people be successful. I've also been in rooms where he's come in like that to do, hey, I'm just here for 20 minutes. We call it Tony time because you don't know when it's starting and you don't know when it's ending. And I've been in rooms where he gets engaged and the clock goes away. And I think that's part of what makes him who he is. So, it sounds like he really vibed out with you guys. So, thanks so much for sharing so much about your journey. Again, I really wanted to focus on that today because I think it's a true story of perseverance and rediscovering yourself, that you did really well throughout your life from a professional standpoint, but also had to kind of regroup 11, 12 years ago, right? And do it again and reinvent yourself and do that in a way that was going to be, I guess, more fulfilling for you long term. So, how can our folks, I mean, we'll put all your stuff in our show notes, but how can our folks connect with you? Obviously the podcast, but,
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if your audience wants to follow me, you can follow me on social media. I ask everybody, if you want to learn, I don't care whether you follow me. I care whether you care about the girls. I care whether you care about missions that I care about. So if you do follow me and you're interested in learning more about the amazing girls that have spent time with me and that we help over here, then just drop me a DM and say, "Hey, Spence, heard the story. Would love to know more about the girls." And I will talk to you about them until your ears fall off, because I'm very proud of them.
that's amazing. Well, thanks for everything that you're doing. Thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate you, Spence. And if I could ever do anything for you, please let me know.
It's very kind of you, man. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the nice questions.
You got it. Take care.